Yeah, so perfectionism is, I like to define it as pursuing impossible standards for the sake of feeling worthy of love. So, in other words, to expand on that, perfectionism, it's driven by this belief that we're not good enough. And so, in order for us to feel worthy of love and acceptance, we we feel like the only way that will be acceptable is if we're perfect. So we start pursuing perfection, but because perfection isn't possible to achieve, then we fail, and then we beat ourselves up for failing, and then we feel bad and we feel like very unworthy of love. So then we're like, okay, I need to I need to get worthy of love again. So I need to try to be perfect again. So it's basically this cycle of constantly pursuing perfection, failing, beating ourselves up, and then pursuing perfection again. And it just keeps going because there is never a point at which we are satisfied. Like there's never an end point, I suppose.
Um, I want to know what causes perfectionism. Is
Mm,
there like a
mm.
trigger or
That's a really good question. So there are a lot of factors that contribute to perfectionism. So there definitely are some personality traits, like biological factors, that make us a bit more like we do tend towards perfectionism a bit more. But I would say two of the biggest factors that contribute to it would be shame and insecurity.
Mm,
So these develop as a result of messages that we receive from significant figures in our childhood. So if our parents, or even it might be our parents, but it could also be our peers or our siblings or things like that. These people will either verbally or non-verbally give us messages that we're not good enough, and we internalize that message. So then we start saying it to ourselves, and we just constantly are telling ourselves that we're not good enough. And the reason that we tell ourselves that is because we're trying to motivate ourselves to be better so that we'll be accepted. So there is a purpose for that when we're young, but what happens is that that becomes such a habit that that feeling of like shame and insecurity and, oh, I'm not good enough, becomes so ingrained in us that when we get older, it's just, it feels like it's part of who we are. And then we end up pursuing perfection, and as a way to kind of combat that, because we're still holding on to that childlike way of thinking that we just never felt secure enough to let go of. So it's kind of it's actually there for a purpose. It originated as a way of keeping us safe, because if we can correct ourselves and be perfect, then we won't be rejected at school, we won't be corrected by our parents. So it really is like a coping mechanism that just carries into adulthood.
yeah, if it is something that, stems out from our childhood. So I think just for me, when one way for us to overcome perfectionism is to really go back to that story or to the childhood story that we had. And so to
Mhm,
identify why is it that I'm this way, or why is it that I'm too perfectionist in some
mhm.
way. Yeah, and thank you for that, Shawnee. And also, I would like to ask as well: is perfectionism can be a bad thing or a good thing?
This is a really interesting question. I like this question a lot because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about this. Um, First of all, society tells us that perfectionism is a positive thing.
Mm,
And from young, we're raised to, like, we are praised when we do well, and we're corrected or we're scolded or whatever when we do poorly. So I think from society, we do get that idea that, okay, well, it must be possible for me to avoid failure. So there's that piece of it that society tells us. And then in terms of the like scholarly side of things, in terms of how scholars understand perfectionism, there's a division in terms of whether it's good or bad. So there's this man named Don Hamachek. And in 1978, he actually published this article that it split perfectionism into two types. So he said that, so according to him, there's adaptive perfectionism, where you basically are striving for high standards. This would be like your professional athletes. So you're like striving for high standards. And if you fail, then you learn from that failure and you kind of course correct. But then there's maladaptive perfectionism. And that is where you strive for not high standards, but perfection, which is not actually possible to achieve. And then you're really hard on yourself when you fail. So in other words, adaptive perfectionists, that's like the positive version, and maladaptive is the negative. But I guess for me, I would say that it's negative, because for me, like if you look at the actual definition of perfectionism, perfectionism is defined as something that, if anything is short of perfectionism, it is unacceptable. So that's how Merriam-Webster defines it, is it's a disposition to regard anything short of perfection as unacceptable. So to me, that I would say that it looks like it's quite negative. Like, I don't think that adaptive perfectionism really is a thing, because that to me sounds more like you're striving for high standards.